Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm John M. Hawkins. You're listening to My Strategy. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. We're very happy to be here with you today and glad you could join us. My Strategy episodes are live and on Saturdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. Today we're going to be talking about building consensus in teams. This episode we're going to talk about the art of gaining consensus, driving consensus, getting along with people, and using consensus to build strong teams. Would love to get your phone calls later in the show. The number is 866-451-1451. That's 866-451-1451. Would love to hear from you as well. You can send an email to talk@johnmhawkins.com. That's talk@johnmhawkins.com. And those who send in an email will be automatically entered into our weekly giveaway. We're talking today about consensus. And as we think about consensus, we think about any strategy, and this show's all about personal development. We need to have a day to reflect. And Saturday is the day I choose to reflect on my strategy. But keep in mind that any day is a good day to assess and reflect on your strategy. Now, our show is growing. We're available on iHeart, iTunes, Player FM, YouTube, SoundCloud, Spreaker, and many more digital platforms. So if you want to listen to this episode or a past episode, you can find them there. You can find us on social media. My Twitter handle is @HawkinsJohn, and my website is johnmhawkins.com. And just like anything in life, we need to have a strategy and a plan to help us reach our goals because the best laid plans don't always work. This week, I'm looking for stories on building consensus. Do you have any good examples, tips, or tricks that you'd like to share? Send the email to talk@johnmhawkins.com. Well, today we're talking about building consensus. We're going to talk about consensus making, some of the pros and cons. Is it always good to try and use consensus when making decisions or not? We're going to talk about team decisions that require consensus. Talk a little bit about the factors in team decision making and how we can ensure that consensus is reached. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about getting along with people in any situation. Because I think at the end of the day, whether you're trying to reach consensus or do anything with a team, it is important to get along with those you are working with. I'm going to talk a little bit about the art of getting to yes, techniques for building consensus. Talk a little bit about why people disagree and give you some strategies that you can use to help gain consensus. We're talking about consensus making, the pros and cons. I've got an article here from Suzanne Lucas. And the piece that starts off with consensus decision making sounds like in a way in which you can achieve the best possible outcome from the decisions made at work. If you can bring all team members on board, you've developed a decision that everybody likes, respects, and supports. She says that's the theory, but it often falls flat. While all team members agree to support the consensus decision, the decision may, in fact, not be the optimal decision for the team or the business. She goes through some significant pros and cons of both. She says the pros of consensus-making decision, everyone agrees to support the decision. Reaching a conclusion that everyone on the team supports is a positive, often effective team strategy. With 100% agreement, you can often move forward with confidence, and you don't have to worry about another employee working to undermine your efforts. Everybody can see the benefit in that. She says to get everyone to agree, it generally, but not always, means that the decision made will benefit every group within the team or organization. You're not sacrificing good HR, for example, to make finance happy, or vice versa. She says you present a unified front. And I think that's what consensus is all about. She says leadership teams often have to make decisions that employees don't like or support. That's part of leadership. You'll find it's easier to convince employees who may not like the decision that they receive a consistent message from their managers and senior leaders. The team experiences a collaborative spirit. When you come to a group consensus, your climate for employees feels quite cooperative. Everybody's ideas were heard, and you came to a decision that all team members could support. This interactive process can bring about a good feeling of goodwill. Boy, lots of benefits to reaching consensus. She says there are some downsides to consensus. She said committees can agree to make bad decisions. Says in a recent news group, a group of 14 teachers dressed up as border wall and Mexicans. Many parents and students were offended, and some parents even inquired about moving their kids out of the school. This is as business writer Eric Sherman said, individuals can generate bad ideas, but it takes a committee for a real disaster. So on the con side of coming to consensus, she said that there's this construct called groupthink. And she said the Halloween disaster is an example of groupthink where the desire to reach a consensus can cause people to ignore indications that what is proposed as a bad idea. The team pushes aside data that may derail the consensus decision. She says ways to identify groupthink is illusions of invulnerability lead members of the group to overly optimistic and engage in risk-taking. Unquestioned beliefs lead members to ignore possible moral problems and ignore the consequences of individual and group actions. Rationalization prevents members from reconsidering their beliefs and causes them to ignore warning signs. Stereotyping leads members of the group to ignore or even demonize out other members who may oppose their ideas or challenge the group's ideas. Self-censorship causes people who might have doubts to hide their fears and misgivings. Mind guards act as self-appointed censors to hide problematic information from the group. The illusion of unanimity leads members to believe that everyone is in agreement and they feel the same way, and direct pressure to conform. We did talk about peer pressure a couple shows ago. So I think it comes down to, a couple things here. There is time and there are decisions when we want to get to consensus, but we also have to be aware of some of the downsides of consensus. And we need to really be strategic in determining which decisions are ones that we should have as the team deciding, right? There's leadership that sometimes needs to step in and make executive decisions that aren't in anyone's best interest, and the consensus wouldn't be that. But also, if you are working towards building a consensus on a specific decision, such as the example with the Halloween costumes, you also need to take into how we deal with those individuals in the group who are making those decisions. And we're going to cover a lot of that in segment 5, where we talk about why people disagree, and we're going to talk about how you can handle that. So hopefully, we can think about this from the perspective of it's important for us to reach consensus. It is definitely a tool that can be used in a leader's bag to be able to bring about effective teamwork, but there are also some downsides of it. So today's show, we're going to be talking about all of that, and hopefully by the end of the show, you'll have some good ideas as to when to use consensus building. We're going to give you some tips, and you can figure out strategically when you want to gain consensus. Also understand when there's times when having a consensus is not in the best interest. And then we're going to give you some tips to help you get a group to get to a consensus agreement. You're listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins, coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. When we come back, we're going to be talking about team decisions that require consensus. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. You're listening to My Strategy. I'm John M. Hawkins, and we're coming to you live from the PBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Right before the break, we were talking about consensus, the pros and the cons of getting to consensus. In this segment, I want to talk about team decisions and how they require consensus. Because sometimes getting to consensus is important. I've got an article here where it talks about team decision making and talks about some techniques that every leader must learn. It says team decision making is a core factor in the professional services industry, but it's complex, challenging activity. Do it right, and you will deliver smart solutions for your clients and make your company look good. Do it poorly, and you'll end up with biased, unsupported, or poor decisions that could make you lose clients. But no matter how complex team decision-making is, it's one effective way to arrive at a solid decision. A large breadth of perspective can help us come up with the best solutions and problems for our businesses. Now, these tips also apply to any sort of group decision. It could be a nonprofit, could be a family environment, could be a group of friends. So these skills do relate across the board. It says when decisions involve a huge amount of data, or when they require different ideas or an exploration of different angles. For these things, you will need a team. Your team could be the board, the managers, the team leaders, even your rank and file employees. If it's a family environment, it could be the children in the family. It says when you're faced with team decisions, though, what's the best way for you to manage the team and ensure the decision reached is the best possible solution? That's what we're going to find out. It says factors in team decision-making. Team-based decisions often give us a way to a large variety of viewpoints and skills. The best way to manage these differences involves a consideration of the following factors. What is the type of decision to be made? Are these decisions strategic in nature? Are they related to performance? Does this concern how things are done in the company? Availability. How much time and resources can be allocated to deal with this decision? The nature of the task. Will the team be able to bring appropriate knowledge and expertise required? Commitment. Will the team be committed to deliver? So it's the type of decision, availability, the nature of the task, and commitment. Now, some team decisions are fairly simple, and we do this just, human nature takes over. What kind of food do we want to have for our lunch? It's a pretty easy one to do. You talk to all the people involved, and for many people, they have either a food allergy or a certain type of preference. You're able to come to an agreement on what the type of food would be. You then identify any sort of allergies, and you address those individually. You're able to come to a decision fairly quickly. Everybody gets lunch, and it's easy to do. But that's not the case with all business decision making. It says, how can we ensure team consensus? It says, number one, ensure and encourage participation. I think this is an important one. It says, have you ever had one of those team meetings where a certain member pitches in more ideas more assertively than the rest? This can often result in a skewed conclusion, which can have negative repercussions on the decision. Many times does that happen? You're in a meeting, and there's one person who's always going to voice their opinion, and very loudly. They are the squeaky wheel. They get the grease, and you feel like you are always taking their side. And I can tell you there's a number of different meeting techniques out there. One of them is Robert's Rules of Order, which has been around for a couple hundred years, I think, and it specifically was designed to mitigate those types of confrontations, and it's used in government quite frequently and also in other organizations. The second thing is to introduce multi-voting. We're all familiar with this method, having lived through elections and company meetings. Voting is useful when you are served with many options. But what happens when all options get an equal amount of votes? You get no conclusive decision. The solution to this dilemma? Multi-voting. Each member of the team is given a certain number of votes with different weights. Each member then goes through all the options and assigns a weight to each solution. This encourages groups members to think thoroughly through each option more thoroughly and use of weighted votes to decrease the chance of a stalemate. I think getting people's input on decisions is very important. In this case, with the multi-vote, they're introducing an algorithm, a formula that is going to give you the ability to get people's input, get them engaged and involved in the decision-making process because they're having to address it directly, and there's options that they have to address. It's just not a yay or a nay decision. The other one is pinpoint priorities. We're usually able to prioritize our tasks, but when we're placed in a group environment, it becomes a little harder to rank and prioritize everybody's tasks collectively. The most common problem we face is that managers think that their project should be prioritized over others. So how can we reach a resolution? For situations like this, she suggests the modified board account comes in handy. It establishes a framework for ranking priorities that will aid the team in deciding which option is best, and you can help qualify those priorities. And then the fourth strategy is involve the team in developing the solution. And I love this one. You always want to have the team involved in the solution because not only will you get, hopefully, the best solution if done properly, but you also are going to get them committed to it. They're going to have helped create the vision. As a result, they're going to want to help see that vision through. When you're working with people with diverse personalities and viewpoints in a complex project where the solution is not clear, sometimes it's difficult to arrive at a well-supported decision. By using Harnet's consensus-oriented decision-making model, all members of the team are involved in developing a solution, making them feel ownership of the final decision, boosting their ability to think creative and having ideas without fearing judgment. I think in summary, it really comes down to there's a lot of different tools out there that we can be using in our own worlds to try and come to consensus. And we have, when you realize that when you are dealing with a large group, there are many more dynamics, many more dimensions. So sometimes those tools can really help you to come to a consensus. And, you don't have to use one tool over the other. Test it out in a small meeting and see how it works. And if it works in a small group, you can then try it in a larger group. I find it's very effective. You're listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. When we come back, we're going to talk about how to drive consensus, knowing who you are dealing with. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm John M. Hawkins. We're on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. The show is called My Strategy. Right before the break, we were talking about team decision making. In the segment, I want to talk about how to drive consensus. I've got an article here that talks about 7 secrets to driving consensus. Stephen Toback is the author. He says, there's probably no such thing as an established definition of the word leadership, but I'll tell you what it means to me. The ability to get people moving in a single direction. Perhaps the most critical test of leadership ability is the business environment is in driving consensus. When you've got a management team made up of highly intelligent, highly opinionated people, he said, let me tell you, building consensus can be remarkably challenging, to say the least, especially when it's a critical decision on a controversial topic, even more so when it means things may have to change. He says, nobody likes change. Having done this sort of thing, I don't know how many times he has given us a 7-step process that he seems to think works remarkably well. I guess in going through it, we can be the judge and see how Steve did. He starts off with the first one. Know who you are dealing with. You may think that everybody's on the same team, so their goals are aligned. It would be nice if that were true, but it almost never is. Sure, they may say they're aligned, but everybody has their own agenda, and it's not as nefarious as it sounds. After all, it's natural to want to protect your domain. So is that true? Do we all have agendas? I think we do. So since you may be a consultant and the group may not report to you, you want to get to know them individually and try to identify their interest. I think that's a good point here because, when we're in business or in family, we really have to have deep relationships with people to gain trust. I've done several podcasts on trust. And knowing who you're dealing with is important. If you're just spending time with people on a business level, and you don't understand who they are and what drives them, it can be difficult to know them. Number 2, he says, lay it all out. You might think that staying in control is critical to the process. Indeed, that's true, but the way we achieve that isn't by being authoritative. Pulling rank is the last thing you should do because it can really piss people off and turn them against you. Well, I think that one makes sense. Number 3 is get to the bottom of it. One way or another, you have to get the complete, unadulterated truth about the situation at hand before you get too far down the path. That usually means meeting with folks one-on-one in confidence as opposed to grilling people in front of their peers. Well, I would think that is obvious, but it does make sense. If there is more information and due diligence that you need to get, do that offline as opposed to in front of the whole group. Number 4, he says, bring out the outliers. It's a good idea to let the outliers, the highly opinionated folks on either side of the equation, have their say before you get too far down the path of making your arguments. The reason is twofold. If you draw them out early, you and everyone else can start to get comfortable with what people feel or believe. That and letting people have a voice, relieve tension and contention as well. One of the hot stuff is once all the hot stuff is out on the table, everyone will breathe a sigh of relief. I think that talks to those outliers and those who might be sitting through the conversation. You have no idea what they're thinking. They could be fuming and steaming inside, but you don't know unless you hear from them. Make it logical. There are 2 types of arguments that work in driving consensus. He likes to use both in a sort of 2-punch method. The first is a logical or quantitative argument that will appeal to the so-called left-brainer. Make sure you've done your homework, your research, and give it to them straight. It's hard to refute hard data. Keep in mind, if you're going to be selective about what you present and how you present it, be aware that you might be called on it. And there's a very good reason why you're presenting it. A and omitting B. Remember, this is the argument that's supposed to appeal to the logical folks. So it should be logical. And make it personal. Of course, the second type of argument is an emotional or qualitative one, but the method he likes to use accomplishes one that's not so obvious. If at all possible, he uses specific anecdotes or words directly out of the mouths of credible individuals to really get his point across and hit people, he says, right between the eyes. The key, of course, is to choose the juiciest and most hard-hitting stories or quotes. I think that this is something that is a strategy that you can use. The other thing to do is, as people are working together to join consensus, capture the quotes and the thoughts of those who have made points in your decision-making process and replay those throughout the decision-making process. That's going to show that you're listening because it's active listening. You're repeating what someone has said. It's not just all about you as the person facilitating the meeting, but you're making it personal and letting everyone know that you heard what Jane said or you heard what John said, and you are then able to repeat those, and it makes for a stronger argument. Finally, he says, close the deal. So obviously, there's going to be a debate throughout the process, but most of it should have worked itself out by then, by the time you finish your quantitative and qualitative analysis. By then, heads should be nodding more or less in the same direction. So those are some of the ideas that Steve has with regard to driving consensus. Knowing who you're dealing with, laying it all out, get to the bottom, build the outliers, make it logical, make it personal. I think you're going to find that while we've got this opinion from Steve on how he would do it, there's a lot that goes into consensus and decision making. Is this a decision that we as a group should be making? We talked about that in the segment 1. Is this a decision that is really in the best interest of everyone? And even though we can come to an agreement as a group, how did we go about coming to that particular outcome? So there's a lot to it, and that's why we've dedicated an entire show to trying to talk about how to go about gaining consensus, because it's not really a one-size-fits-all approach. It definitely does take a strategy. It takes different tactics. It's going to take some thought. And over time, as you start to work harder and harder with your team on gaining consensus, it's just going to start to come more naturally. And you're going to develop your own framework, your own template, your own tools. And you won't need to have all of this information that we're going through to try and figure out how to do it, because it will be second nature. And I think that's what we're all trying to do with personal development, is learn the basics so that we can apply that in the future. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. And this is my strategy. When we come back, we're going to talk about tips to getting along with people in any situation. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm John M. Hawkins. You're listening to My Strategy. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. If you're just joining us, My Strategy episodes are live and on Saturdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. In this episode, we're talking about building consensus in teams. We're talking about the art of gaining consensus, driving consensus, getting along with people, and using consensus to build strong teams. Now, we'd love to get your thoughts. Glad to take your phone calls. Studio number is 866-451-1451. That's 866-451-1451, and we'll get to those later in the show. Or send us an email to talk@johnmhawkins.com. That's talk@johnmhawkins.com. If you're interested in talking about consensus building or any topic as it relates to personal development, then please send the email and start the discussion. Right before the break, we were talking about how to drive consensus. In this segment, I want to transition a little bit, talking about how to get along with people in any situation. For most of the show, we've been talking about techniques and tactics and things you can do. But if you do have a personal relationship with someone, isn't it a lot easier to get them to do what you want them to do? Don't you have a better understanding of them, what their biases are, what they're trying to achieve, what they're trying to do? And you really, if you have a good relationship, you don't need any of this consensus building. You don't need to sit down and go through a formal meeting, because consensus is something that comes naturally as part of the group. I think many times these consensus building tools and team management techniques that we have are in place to give us good structure, to give us the ability to continually produce the good results. But it's also important for us not to forget about that we are dealing with people. I've got an article here by C.J. Goulding. He says, no matter where you fall on the extrovert or introvert scale, wouldn't it be great to learn better tactics to help you get along with the people you encounter in your daily life? Getting along with others is not complicated, but you do have to make a deliberate choice to practice and incorporate these tips into your daily interaction. CJ gives us a number of them. He says, number one, listen with the intent to understand. Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. That's a quote from Stephen R. Covey. Makes sense. If you make understanding another person a priority in any social circle, you will find that it is extremely easy to align with these people. It is the choice to invest the time and emotional effort that the barriers to harmonious living are torn down. Planning or preparing yourself to understand others is a massive first step. Oh, I think that makes sense to me. Listen with the intent to understand. Don't listen with the intent to reply. How many times you ask a question and you're just thinking about, I know the answer, rather than listening with the intent to understand would be, who is asking this question? Why are they asking this question? What is the question? Now, it might sound like a lot of work, but if you can start to think about it from that perspective, it could give you a different view as to why they're asking the question. Walk in their shoes. Like coins, every social interaction has two sides. Sometimes those between people can get blurred and cause misunderstandings. Taking the time to view the situation from someone else's point of view will help you get better along with them, even if you don't agree with their views. As the quote says, you can't understand someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes. And we do have a podcast on perspective, and I think it is important for us to see things from a different vantage point. Number three, be polite. Quite simple, rude people don't get along with others. They may get along with other rude people, but those results have never been proven. Be careful of others' feelings. Wit and humor in another person's expenses may do more damage than you will ever know. I think this is a good point. We talked about bullying a few episodes ago and about how, some of the things we say can make people feel like they are ostracized or they can feel they are demeaned. And if they're not in a good position, how are you going to get them to consensus? Number 4, always take the opportunity to say a kind and encouraging word or two about somebody. Praise good work regardless of who did it. If criticism is needed, offer it gently, never harshly. If you recognize someone in need of encouragement, then that makes you the perfect person to do it. I like that statement. If you notice someone needs encouragement, just do it. There are countless stories of people who have been inspired or motivated by a single needed word or encouragement at critical times in their lives. When you encourage and compliment people, you create a culture of kindness, and kindness will be reciprocated. Generally show interest in others. Showing interest in their pursuits, their work, their families, homes. Celebrate their daily achievements. Grit your teeth with them through the rough times. Dance with the people. Rejoice with them. Take time to weep with those who mourn. Let everyone you meet, however humble, feel that you regard them as a person of importance. If people around you sense that you support their best interests and also care about the ins and outs of their lives, you will get along with them just fine. Well, that's good advice. How many times has someone shown interest in you? Sometimes it's difficult. We sit in our new modern world with our digital devices, our tablets, our laptops, our smartphones, our smartwatches, our smart air conditionings, smart everything. But the smart things can help us get through the day. But at the end of the day, they are not able to be, to respond to us. They're not able to show interest in what we do. They're merely helping us with our tasks. Number 6, he says, keep an open mind. Discuss, but don't argue. It's the mark of a superior mind to be able to disagree without being disagreeable. Accept that others may have a point of view different from you or believe something that you do not believe yourself. One sign of an open mind is someone who will listen to someone else speak without interrupting, even if they disagree with you. Differences make us human. Idiosyncrasies make us unique and special. Finally, listen intently. We talked a little bit about that with the active listening. He also says, be positive, be sincere. I don't know. I think that CJ does have some pretty good tips and tricks here for gaining consensus. A little bit different perspective, but if we get along with people, it makes it that much easier. You're listening to My Strategy. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. When we come back, we're going to talk about the art of getting to yes, techniques for building consensus. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. You're listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the PBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Well, I'm very happy to be here with you today, and I'm really glad that you could join us on our My Strategy. Today we're talking about building consensus in teams. Love to get your thoughts. Take your phone calls at 866-451-1451 or send an email to talk@johnmhawkins.com. That's talk@johnmhawkins.com. And if you send an email to talk@johnmhawkins.com, you can be entered into our weekly giveaway. Right before the break, we took a little bit of a shift from talking about techniques to use consensus, and we were talking about tips to get along with people in any situation. Kind of a nice little segment. I enjoyed talking about that. This segment, I'm going to transition a little bit. At this show, we talk about how to go about, building your strategy, helping with personal development. I've got this systematic approach, which is awareness, assess and analyze, strategize and plan, implement your plan, and support and evaluate. Over time, it becomes second nature, and you don't have to really think about all of it. Sometimes the awareness becomes, it just happens, second nature. Then you assess, then you implement. Well, as we're thinking about getting to consensus building, assuming that we've got a good strategy or we have a good understanding of why we're doing what we're doing, why consensus is the most important, and it's not an authoritarian type decision that needs to be made or a leadership decision, and we've got everybody participating. We then want to figure out the group dynamics and how to get everybody to agree and build consensus. I've got an article here. It talks about the art of getting to yes, 5 techniques for building consensus. And there's some interesting points in here that I want to highlight. It says facilitators and consultants are often charged with helping groups work together to create solutions that address issues, meet objectives, resolve problems, etc. One of the skills that is important to bring to the table is the ability to build consensus, even when the starting point appears to be significant disagreement. He says, in our work at Leadership Strategies, that's the folks that wrote this article, we have found it helpful to think about the disagreement at 3 levels. In addition, we employ 5 core consensus building strategies depending upon the level of disagreement. So it says, why do people disagree? And in the prior segments, we kind of learned why people disagree. But it says our work with hundreds of groups over the past 5 years has led them to categorize disagreements into 3 basic categories. He says people tend to disagree for 3 main reasons generally, and more often than not, due to the first reason below. And this is what I found interesting, because they've categorized these different reasons people disagree. It says people have not clearly heard or understood the alternatives and reasons for supporting the alternative. So the first level is they're just not hearing each other. They're talking past each other, I would assume is what they mean here. Second is they've heard and understood, but they have had different experiences or hold values that result in preferring one alternative to the other. They have different values or experiences. And I think I would break that up into 2 different ones. I think one of them is if you've had gone through consensus before and made a decision and the result didn't turn out the way you wanted it to, and you're doing it based on experience, I think that is one level. But a second level, to me at least, and they've combined these into one, is values. I think values and value systems many times speak for themselves. And if you look at trying to reach consensus among things like religion and politics, those definitely are different values as opposed to just experiences. The disagreement is, and the third level they have is the disagreement is based on personality, past history with one another, or other factors that have nothing to do with the alternatives. Okay, so this is a good one, right? I mean, if you have outside factors and you have a personality conflict, let's say that person that you're working with, you both were in a line for a promotion, and that person got promoted to your boss, that's an outside factor. Or let's say, for example, you were working on a deal together with one member, and the member did something to take the credit for what you did. It makes it difficult to come together and now try and work and build consensus. Says the facilitator has techniques to address the first two reasons. However, disagreement based on personality or past history cannot be resolved in the session. Therefore, it's important that you determine, okay. So addressing a level 3 disagreement, and this is the one where there's outside factors. He says, how do you recognize a level 3 disagreement? If the argument has no logic or at its base, or the parties arguing show no interest in resolving the argument, then the problem is probably personality or past history. If this is so, consider the following course of actions. Take a break. Meet with parties privately to indicate that you do not believe the issue can be solved in the session. Seek agreement to go to a higher source for resolution outside the session. I mean, that could be an arbitrator, could be a counselor, somebody who comes in and helps. Don't attempt to resolve the issue in the session. Typically, issues have, based on personality or past history, take more time than you can afford to give. Well, that's fair. I think, too, using some of the other techniques that we learned about in prior segments, really understanding active listening, getting people to participate can help. Something else that I think might be helpful is getting them into a different environment. If you're in a friendly environment or an environment that is associated with negative feelings, get them out of that environment. Get them to a different situation, because when you get into the different situation, you don't feel as comfortable, as secure, but also you don't have all of those negative feelings that you might have had in that old environment. So that's another thing they could do. And then they said, based on level 1 and 2, they recommend the appropriate consensus building techniques. Delineating alternatives, discussing strengths and weaknesses, merging alternatives, building criteria list, and converging upon an alternative. They go through and identify all of these in the article, but just something to be thinking about, as we start to think about our strategies here and how are we going to go about coming to an agreement and building consensus. We need to start to bring all of these tools and techniques into play, or at least have them at our disposal. We then need to assess the situation, assess the group, and figure out who is this group, why are we trying to get to consensus? Is this a decision that makes sense to reach consensus on? And once we have that, we can put together our strategy. You're listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins, coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. When we come back, we're going to talk about putting your plan in place. We'll be right back. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. You're listening to My Strategy. I'm John M. Hawkins, and we're coming to you live on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Well, if you missed this show, you can listen on iHeartRadio, Apple, iTunes. And if you'd like to have something covered in the show, send an email to talk@johnmhawkins.com or give us a call at 1-844-MY-STRATEGY. That's talk@johnmhawkins.com or give us a call at 844-MY-STRATEGY. If you do send out the email, you'll still have a chance to get entered into our weekly giveaway. All right, today we've been talking about building consensus in teams. This episode, we've been talking about the art of gaining consensus, driving consensus, getting along with people, using consensus to build strong teams. We started off talking about consensus, the pros and cons. Pros and cons of consensus decision-making. Is it always good to use consensus as a strategy to reach an agreement with teams? We learned a little bit about the pros of doing that. Feels good. Great. Everybody agrees. Let's move on. But committees can also make bad decisions. And there's this construct of groupthink, whereas the teams start to come together and, if they are not using objective reasoning, sometimes they can make bad decisions. So we want to be wary of that. We then went on to talk a little bit about team decision-making and how it does require consensus, the factors in team decision-making. How do we ensure team consensus? And I think one of the keys there was encouraging participation. It's one thing to realize that, you've got to make a decision. But if you're in a meeting and there's 20 people in the room and there's one facilitator or leader, you have 5 vocal people and a few others that answer questions and the rest remain silent, is that really consensus? They might not be engaged. They might not be paying attention. They're sitting on their laptops. They're not engaged in the conversation, or they don't care about the decision. Well, if you're in a situation where you're expending that many resources, it might not be an important enough decision to try and reach consensus on. So we want to really think about what is the decision we're trying to make, what of its relevance, importance, what is the impact to what we are trying to do. And when we try and do that, we need to get our team to engage and participate, because if they don't engage and participate, in some cases it can lead to disastrous results. We then talked a little bit about how to drive consensus by knowing who you are dealing with, really getting to know people. Who is it that you are trying to gain consensus with? Have you laid everything out? Have you explained all the options, the background, the history of how we got to here, why it is important for this team to come together? What is the vision and goal? How are we going to go about leveraging the outcome of this team? If the team that's coming together to try and gain consensus knows that they have a greater purpose, a higher power, something that they need to provide that could strategically help or hinder an organizational effort, they might be more engaged. Of course, we've also got some outliers out there, those who might be sitting in the meetings fussing and fuming, not really engaged in the conversation, but their looks definitely are distant or angry, showing lots of emotion. Get them from out of the fray into the core discussions. Figure out what's going on. And we might need to use some strategies where we get them together outside of our teams. And we talked about getting people trying to get along in any other situation. Listen with the intent to understand, walk in their shoes, and be polite. And that was probably my favorite tip, because it doesn't talk about all these fancy frameworks and SWOT analyses and how we go about doing this from a functional perspective, but it really talks about people, which is what business life is all about. How do we get along with people? How do we, make sure that we have their best interest, walk in their shoes, be polite, say please and thank you. Maybe those are values that we need to revisit from time to time. We then went into the art of getting to yes and talked about how we can build consensus. It was an interesting perspective on creating levels for each of the various types of people who disagree and how we can go about addressing their disagreement and ultimately finding out some of those tactics that we can use. But of course, it always comes down to breaking habits, being aware of them, and conscious prioritization. Coaching can always help. Well, that's all for today. Appreciate you being with us. We will see you next time.